So the idea that to catch a criminal, or to catch a serial killer more specifically, you've got to think like a serial killer. Well, that's one of the oldest tropes we have now, and it's not too far a leap to then say, to think like a serial killer, you've maybe got to have a little bit of serial killer in you as well. And it's very common. I'm watching a show right now that's just come out, The Alienist, very similar idea there as well. And it's very interesting that one of the first things we hear Holden say, where he says our society's sick and therefore the crime that we're seeing is sick as well, that's very similar to a very famous quote by Richard Ramirez, a very famous serial killer. So it's interesting. I don't know if that was intentional to kind of try to give a bit of foreshadowing to what we'll see later on, but maybe I'm being unfair. We also hear Holden's girlfriend, who he meets when they're first flirting, about Durkheim and deviancy. She says a very similar thing as well, that, you know, our society, the crime reflects society, and that's a common thing lots of people say. So maybe I'm being a bit unfair, but I thought it was an interesting, maybe a little bit of foreshadowing. And also in that first episode, the very first thing we see, and this sets up the fundamental distinction that separates Holden from a lot of his contemporaries, is he sees criminals not as these bad apples that need to be defeated and crushed. No, he sees criminals as people, just like everyone else that maybe made a few wrong turns, but fundamentally they're the same as us and they should be empathized with, and we need compassion. And what's so interesting is in the series, we see the downsides to this compassion and this empathy that we maybe don't see in other shows. And what I'm referring to in the first episode is when they're doing the hostage negotiation and the person who's holding the hostages, he kills himself, and everyone else says this is 100% good because all the hostages are safe and this low-life criminal died. Holden sees it as a negative because ideally he wants to save everyone, even the most toxic among us. So why is Holden so fascinated by the psychology of serial killers, psychology in general? One explanation is that he's pretty socially awkward, and maybe for him, he wants to try to study psychology, humanity, something that he intuitively doesn't seem to understand like everybody else. And it's interesting, the parallels start where a lot of serial killers, they're very fascinated by humans and humanity because in some ways, they're not really human and they don't really understand a lot of things that we take for granted. So we start to see the parallels between Holden and serial killers. Another parallel, maybe he wants to study serial killers and he has no qualms about pretending to be on their side and saying these horrible things to gain their trust because he will do anything to win, and he thinks serial killers are so evil and so bad that he's willing to do whatever it takes to catch them. And it's funny, the parallel is serial killers with no conscience, no remorse, they're able to do whatever it takes to achieve success, and that's one of their biggest advantages and allows them to rise so high in politics and business. Or there's this idea of him being a narcissist, and in some sense he likes studying serial killers because it's a way that he can feel very important. It's similar to the very famous book White Noise, where he studies Hitler and he has a whole department of Hitler studies, and he likes it because in some ways studying Hitler, it gives him this feeling of power. And at one point later in the season, he's brought in for a disciplinary meeting, and you start to see maybe a bit of the narcissism. He says, my only mistake was ever doubting myself. It reminded me a lot of Mark Zuckerberg in the movie The Social Network. He's brought in for a meeting with the disciplinary board, and he says, I think I deserve credit for, invading all these people's privacies to show you just how weak your privacy systems are, or something along those lines. Is interesting. The Social Network, that's it's a movie directed by David Fincher. He also produced this, so interesting little parallel there as well. And what I was very surprised by with this TV series, oftentimes when you see shows that depict in history the trailblazers, the old guard who doesn't understand these new methods, they're portrayed in a very negative light, and the trailblazers are portrayed in a very positive light. This showed more complexity, and it showed a lot of the downsides to this new way of thinking and this new way of profiling serial killers. And one is that, to some extent, there's this very common psychology thing where pretending to be evil can actually make you evil. And I guess most famous example would be the Stanford prison experiment, where they put people in these different roles. Some pretended to be criminals, some pretended to be guards. And eventually the people pretending to be guards, they became authoritarian assholes, and the people pretending to be criminals, they became these lying, sneaky people. So sometimes the labels, and when you act out these roles, they can actually change you at a fundamental level. And we see the divide within law enforcement still prevalent today in this show, they call it the Old Testament view of good and evil and black and white, and crime is committed by the small minority of people that are born evil, and we just have to defeat them, and that's what law enforcement is. And then we see the other side, which is no, we have to be empathetic and forgiving. And this Old Testament view yeah, it seems like the show sometimes pokes fun at it. Some of the quotes seem over the top. Our job is not to commiserate with these people, it's to electrocute them. But the show, which I like, also shows the downsides to the other approach. One of these is just the practical, that when you're studying these serial killers, why would a serial killer really give you honest information about their motivations? And you see the way these serial killers must look at Holden, especially when he comes in and he's dutifully taking notes. I mean, these serial killers, they're going to lie, they're going to play games with him. So all this data is very suspect. You also see there is a kind of moral issue with when you have these people who've done these horrible things, and then you say, well, they actually have such unique insight and they have this knowledge that's so valuable. To some extent, you could say there is kind of just an ickiness to that maybe you should say that's not a good argument against using the information. But I think a lot of people would say, look, it's just immoral to acknowledge that these people who've done such horrible things have any kind of insight that we should listen to. And then there's the issue that once we start looking at signs of serial killers, the red flags, that we start pathologizing just normal behavior. Like we see that teacher who was tickling his students for nickels, and I think that raised the issue of once you start having this worldview and you see everything in terms of, well, all this behavior is linked to serial killers, suddenly you start to look at anything and anyone can be a serial killer. And as I said, Holden, a lot of his behaviors, they could be construed as being a serial killer. So there's two interpretations. One is that, oh yeah, Holden is actually, he is a budding serial killer, or he has these traits he shares. Another is just, look, any kind of attempt to associate things with other things, you're going to be always walking that slippery slope, because almost anything, if you work hard enough, can be associated with something else. And then there's this issue of preemption. So if you know that you have these traits that are highly associated with being a serial killer, at what point do you feel an obligation to step in before the actual killing starts? And how is it moral to do so? And the best example of this, the movie Minority Report, really explores this idea that if you know, or if you have a high probability that someone is going to commit a crime in the future, how do you work out the moral issues with stopping them before the crime itself actually takes place? And what kind of profiling do we actually see on the show? What do they say about the psychology of these killers? Well, the most famous killer we see is Edmund Kemper, more famously known as the father of Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. Now, they seem to say that what happened with him is oftentimes you have abusive fathers or absent fathers, and the mother who stays and raises the kid, she takes out her rage at the father in general, and the kid often looks like the father, at least in Kemper's case, or men in general. She takes out her rage on the only person that's both around her, and there's that access factor, and then also smaller and weaker. And then what you get is you have the experience of the son who experiences this overbearing mother humiliating him in his perception, and then he also gets these ideals of masculinity put in from the culture that men have to be strong and they have to be powerful. So this creates a conflict within him, and in some sense he lashes out to reassert his masculinity, and then also does to women what deep down he really wants to do to his mother. And it's interesting, we actually hear the line twice, all fathers are absent fathers, or all fathers to some extent are absent fathers. We hear that twice. Different ways to interpret it. One way is, I guess, maybe these same ideals of masculinity that prevent most men from really expressing emotions. Even if a father stays and is in the home, because he's so emotionally closed off, he's not really able to form a bond with his son, and in some sense then all sons kind of feel this void of this lack of a true connection with their father. But while I think the show, it sometimes gives these psychological explanations, I think it comes down firmly on the side that, look, there are elements to the universe that we're never going to understand, and serial killers, to an extent, are this element of the universe that we can't ever understand. And at one point, one of the serial killers says, you know why they died? It just wasn't their night. And it drives home this idea that these are crimes that are motiveless, that are strangers killing each other, and it challenges our ideas that if you live your life in a certain way and if you do certain things, you can avoid certain outcomes. So if you associate only with good people, if you never sleep with someone else's spouse, to some extent you can avoid being killed by a jealous lover. If you never really have too much and you never have an excess of wealth and riches, to some extent you can stave off someone feeling greedy and killing you to steal your wealth. But with serial killers, when it's just a random person and a random act of violence, that's that random element of the universe that we are so scared and fearful of, and to some extent that explains our deep fear of serial killers. being killed by a serial killer, it's relatively low, the chances of that. So it's somewhat an irrational fear. But why it's such a potent fear is because there's nothing you can really do to avoid it. However, I will say, I think it's very interesting how the archetypes of who commits these large acts of violence, it seems to change over time and change with the time. So when you had outlaws back in the Wild Wild West, that was very different. Those were public enemy number one. This is very different than when you get to the 70s, the 80s, and you see these big names like Berkowitz and Manson. Manson's a little different. I won't include Manson. Someone like Berkowitz or someone like, and even Berkowitz, he was kind of crazy. Not a good example. Someone like Ted Bundy, just classic serial killer, this kind of hunter that does it quietly in private. So different than the old outlaws, but also so different than we think of now what's part of the trend of mass violence. And we think of the school shooters, Columbine. We think of terrorists and terrorism. We think of the people just shoot up movie theaters. That's very different than someone like Ted Bundy meticulously tracking victims over a period of many years, to some extent not doing it for the spotlight, the attention, at least initially, trying not to get caught. So it's just interesting how mass violence, it does seem to kind of change with the times, and rather than serial killers being this constant that's always there and we can't understand anything about it at all, no, it seems like maybe there are some factors that do influence it, and we can maybe at least try to get a handle on the problem, if not stamp it out forever.